Well, thanks for coming, everybody. The title of this talk is Citizen Science and Amateur Radio, or How to Use Your Radio to Advance Scientific Knowledge in these times where everybody's really bored with going on the radio because you can't hear anybody and so on. So I'm going to try tonight to tell you what some of the other things you can do with your radios at home. A, can take the boredom out of life, and B, can actually tip you off as to when good conditions are happening, when other people are successfully having contacts, and so on. So we've got to use other techniques to find out about what, we can't just go on blindly and hope to get a DX contact at all. Some of you might not understand my jargon, some of the visitors. Please do ask me afterwards what I've meant and so on. I don't want to make it too complicated, but I can be contacted on this email if you want to know more. I'm very happy to do more intensive work with people to help get their radios going on the modes that I've got. It took me a long time to get my radio to go on this particular mode that I'm talking about today. Well, what is citizen science? I kind of came up with that word because I'd heard it somewhere, but I didn't realize it was a thing. Well, I'll read from Wikipedia. That's the best thing. Citizen science, also known as community science, crowdsourced science, civic science, volunteer monitoring, or online citizen science, is scientific research conducted in whole or in part by amateur or non-professional people, non-professional scientists, should I say. Citizen science is sometimes described as public participation in scientific research, particularly monitoring and participatory action, research whose outcomes are often advancements in scientific research, as well as an increase in the public's understanding of science. Most of the citizen science that I've discovered online is to do with ecology, tracking animals, following water levels, all sorts of things like that. Another quote from the same thing in Wikipedia: newer technologies have increased the options for citizen science. Citizen scientists can build and operate their own instruments to gather data for their own experiments or as part of a larger project. Examples include amateur radio, they've mentioned it, amateur astronomy, maker activities, which are quite a lot to do with kids and stuff like that, kids research or university research, students, should I say. Okay, well, as it says there, there's a picture of that on the page, but no picture of anything amateur radio. So we must get on that page and start editing it and add our own contribution to it. That's the reason, no sunspots. Okay, so we're at the dip in the sunspot cycle. So a lot of the shortwave broadcasting that we can do is intermittent, to say the least. Not impossible, mind you, not impossible. Every now and again you get half an hour of something going crazy on a band. And as the people who regularly listen on those shortwaves, we just had David over there talking about a great contact on 10 meters the other night, right up to Queensland, suddenly out of the blue. But the trouble is that, of course, this is the cycle. Propagation is poor. People get bored. They don't bother listening. The bands become quiet, and so on. Race to the bottom. So I'm trying to use these techniques to find out what's going on the bands, and encourage myself to go on more often. So I'm going to show you a few things tonight that some of them I haven't even tried, by the way, but I just know that they're there, and I read quite often about these things. But there is one that I'm going to show you at the end that is my particular favourite. And people say to me, they think it's weird because I'm so against some of the digital things I kind of bang on about digital taking over from amateur radio and everything like that. I want to use all this stuff that I play with for the benefit of amateur radio, so that that it actually stays a thing, and that we still can use shortwaves, VHF, and what have you, but we've got some additions to it. So we need to keep track of openings and activity generally. So we must use the modern tools. Contests are a help. I always try to get the young people who've got their licenses, and you'll see some information on the wall about some of the successes we've had thanks to David here with the Scouts. And I've got to stress to the newcomers that they don't have to actually enter the contest to participate. They don't have to send in a score, for instance, necessarily. Just I go on to give a few points away and see who I'm working. And at the end of the day, you've got this sort of mental map that you've worked all over Australia because of the call signs. And you think, well, that was not bad, And so that's a good outing on the amateur bands. Another activity, parks. People going to national parks and transmitting, they're reliable. You can hear people all day on doing that park stuff. So if you really want to contact or you want to show somebody how amateur radio works, that's the time to do it. You go on to 40 metres and have a listen. That's the wife of Paul, PAS, and she obviously follows him everywhere into the bush. They go camping, they go on trips together, and they're always a reliable source of signals. What we do with them is, of course, we use spotting websites, and spotting websites are places that they can report into on the internet, or other people do it for them to let people know they're there. So that's one aspect of social media, which I'm saying is a great saviour of amateur radio, in that it tells other people the stuff happening, gives them a chance to work them. It's not so hard when you've got a frequency to go to and to have a listen and see if you can hear them. Most of my VHF contacts these days are set up in advance, I'm afraid to say. But I can't just drive up to Mount Tarrangower or something and hope for the best. So sometimes I get up there, nobody will even talk to me on a repeater, let alone direct. Although I did talk to Lee, who I'll be mentioning tonight, VK3KKP, who's a big proponent of all this sort of stuff. He's a real enthusiast. And there's a person who's gone on holiday. And he's taken APRS, the position reporting system, with him. He's come over from Sydney, right along the top, done things through Victoria, and up here to Alice Springs. So his holiday was spent in its entirety going on SOTA and parks, all the way up there. Keeping in touch, this is a Facebook page, and all these groups are very well behaved groups, not like the usual Facebook rubbish. So I've just really got a very narrow interest, I'm afraid, in Facebook. It's all to do with amateur radio. Anything amateur radio, I belong to the groups, and that's where I get all my information from about things happening. And I quite often, I've heard the space station going over recently as a result of this sort of communication. Do scientists actually use the data that we generate? Well, you'll remember the talk, most of you, that we've had at the club when Cole told us about his efforts at communicating with this website. He has a receiver at home, picks up the aeroplane's beacons, sends them to this site, they aggregate them, put them into a map, and you can follow the planes in real time. Now there was a thing that happened when there was a solar eclipse in America. They had all these stations listening and monitoring various beacons all around the country. And as the eclipse happened, various things happened to the ionosphere. And they weren't sure what was going to happen, but they did actually find out. And there's some amazing sort of graphs and things that they produced as a result of this. But that was all done through this HAM-SCI organization in America, which is, of course, another citizen science group. So how do we get involved in that? Has anybody run a skimmer on there? You have? No? Yeah, okay, good. Well, a skimmer is an amazing piece of software. I think it costs about $100. There's a great long period where you can try it out before you have to pay the money. Trouble is I've run out now. It's for PC only, but this can listen to the whole of an audio band, and if a station, well, it can decode the call sign and the fact it's a CQ. So that's kind of neat. And that was way before all these digital modes that we've got nowadays. It's the server version, which I think, yes, that's what we're looking at there. The server there also sends that information down the internet. So people have set up skimmers in their own places, in their own shacks around the world. And that's the reverse speaking network site, which basically gets that information. And down the right-hand side there are 135 skimmers online in the world at that point, including one in New Zealand and none here. I don't know if there are any, but you don't have to run them all the time. But obviously they expect you to try and run them if you can. Now, unfortunately, Google has pulled a fast one. And it says, where's the map? Well, Google has started charging for the maps. So if you're a company like this, or not for profit presumably, you can't afford the maps. So they're working out a way of having the maps from somewhere else, public domain maps. But these are still what's been happening. 2312 on the 17th of September, a CQ from hearing that. And those would appear as dots on a map if they had the map going, but they don't. But reverse beacon network is apparently very good for checking your antennas and so on. Consider this, you've got 2 antennas in your garden. You have to use a different call sign for each of them, but you have a rig that switches over between the 2. And you do CQ, CQ, call sign, CQ, CQ, call sign. And you get a reception report from dotted around the place and how many dBs over the noise it is. So if you do it quick enough so that you don't have any propagation changes in that time, or average it out, you can actually see where your signals are going. And if it was a horizontal aerial and a vertical aerial, you could see the effect of the directivity of it beaming into different parts. So people do use that quite regularly. The Americans publish articles about it in the ARRL magazine, QST, and that's where I got the information about how people were doing a lot of antenna checking. Now that box, going back to the aircraft, they'll give you that box if you promise to leave it on most of the time and have a good internet. That picks up the aircraft transponders, or beacons, should I say, and but they give them away more to people who are like living in remote areas, to fill in the area. My daughter, when this was in early days, my daughter flew across to UK, and when her plane disappeared over the desert, off that map. But of course, she hadn't crashed into the ground. It's just that there's nobody there. But I have noticed on that one that we just looked at now, it's everywhere's covered, the whole of Australia. So people have got receivers in the most unlikely places. But anyway, that's another project. Ships are another way of seeing what's going on about 160 megahertz. That's Lee Rainbird, the VK3KKP I was talking about. Now he's got some mammoth towers, VHF aerials on top. He's up near Wagga, and he appears in every single map of this sort. He's the one receiving them. But he's been tracking planes. He's been tracking the local plane from Bendigo to Sydney, and he can pick the signal up when they land at Sydney. with his antennas, 1090 megahertz. He can actually follow them down to the runway level. That's the sort of map you get with the reverse beacon network. I set this to, this is when they used to have the maps. I think that's on all bands, signals. Yes, that's everybody. But they're using FT8. The list of signals types that you can pick up on that and filter so that you're only looking at them is considerable. But we're looking at all the FT8 stations who are actually sending signals, or who are receiving signals, should I say. These are all receiving signals. So, you can see how useful that might be to see if there's a lot of activity. If you go to the website sdr.hu, you will see this. And this is the output of a receiver that is tuning from 0 to 30 megahertz. And you can go in there and listen to all the stations that it's receiving. So that one is in Italy. And it was receiving a lot of things because it was their night, my day. So I was listening to some signals here, which were single sideband signals. Here's the Chinese station that we hear a lot, AM station. There's a few more that weren't there, and so on. We're setting up one in Neil's place. I've been asked again about it, Neil. We must get it going. It's nearly there. It's nearly there. I've got one at my house that I put on occasionally, and we used it during the contest that we were here running. Well, we used that to listen. It's about 2K away, so it didn't get overloaded by our transmitter, but we were able to hear all the other stations on the band, and the person who was operating that said to the operator of the radio a frequency, and they went there, worked them, and we followed them around the band. So spotting using a receiver, but the receiver was at my house, not here. Anyway, that's what I always tell the people who get into amateur radio early, is go to that site, listen to radios for free. You can hear all the stations from all over the world as they hear them, as if you were there listening to their radio. And some kids at the school I demonstrated this at, the high school here, they were knocked out when they heard Tokyo radio and all the disc jockeys on the AM band, doing their thing and announcing records that sounded vaguely like ours, but with a Japanese voice and things like that. And so they were almost as intrigued by it all as I was when I first listened to my portable transistor radio under my bedclothes, listening to Radio Luxembourg way back. Now, this is another scientific thing. As a result of all these people doing this, the software has changed in those radios recently. Time difference of arrival. There's an article there if you want to have a look at it later. They've been able to locate those number stations and things and all sorts of pirate stations by just looking at 3 different receivers on this, listening to the same signal on 3 different receivers, and then getting them to synchronize their GPSs and what have you. As long as there's not a lot of propagation changes, you can get an exact position of where that transmitter is in the world. And it's amazing. And that article shows you the graphs that they've generated to show you it must be there. That's again
What sort of resolution can you get?
Well,
can you use it to triangulate a signal in a local region?
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know how close you can, but it's like I'm talking 20K or 30K, but from what I've read, if there's not a lot of propagation shifting, which will smear the position. But I've got to have a go at that. I want to have a go at that. Skywarn, that's an American thing, but again, when you read about it in Wikipedia, there are all sorts of people who volunteer to put in weather forecasts from all over America, and they get aggregated as well, and you can get an idea of where the hurricane is. And here we are. Those without radio communication capability can still make their reports via cell phone, landline, or the internet. Now that's the other way round from normal, isn't it? But what they're saying is that probably most people won't be able to make reports if it's really bad, because the cell phones, the landlines and everything else in power will have gone. So the most likely people to do anything about anything at that time will be the radio amateurs. And here also are all the people associated with this Skywarn and Citizen Weather Observer program, amateur radio, civil emergency radio amateur, etc. So, you know, again, it's another one where the crowd is generating that information. This is what I'm going to finish off with now, is that WSPR is the thing that I really like. WSPR, Weak Signal Propagation Reports. It's intended that beacons will transmit their position and a small signal over the whole world. At 6 meters, these are tiny little transmitters located around the place. And that's a pretty amazing signal getting into Darwin. And when they receive anything, or are received, that information gets fed through to whispernet.org, should I say, whispernet.org. And you can then look up all the past history of what's happened. So I've got a WSPR station set up over there, and I'll show you afterwards, if you're interested, while I'm having a cup of tea, is how it's been reported so far. I've been transmitting since I got here about 5 o'clock. It does, my one has been set to do 20% transmit, 80% receive. This is the program that I use to control my radio. It controls the radio through an interface. It triggers the push to talk, so it transmits. It displays a receive signal, and it logs those transmissions. The program's called WSJT-X. You can't see that there, by K1JT, Joe Taylor, a very clever person who's done a lot for amateur radio, but not everything's good, I don't think, but I must start again. But this is one of the best things I've seen for propagation research. That's a WSPR signal. No, it isn't. Anyway, this is what it looks like. A line going on there, that's time going down, and that signal is showing that it's going between 2 time markers. Now, the timing on this has got to be really, really accurate. Your computer clock has to be very accurate. Easy to achieve on the internet, though. The tone that this transmits in WSPR is you can't hear the shift. It's 1.4 hertz or something like that. You can hear a slight wobble if you really imagine it, but that's enough to send information thousands of K with a minute amount of power. Going back to that one where we've got to Darwin, usually it tells you within this little window here how much power you are running. Usually it's 5 watts or something, but I've got a picture of something that happened on top band that got it the other side of the world with about a few milliwatts. And that's the interesting thing. Anyway, you know, these are all the stations that have got computers running, but not necessarily hearing anyone at the moment. But occasionally you get a line across there, and you know that Adelaide has managed to get in contact with Perth. You'd have to have very good, strong signals here to ever get a voice signal to go across. These are like 100 or 1,000 times lower than a voice SSB signal. So, but you can use it to just determine that there is a lot of activity and a lot of good conditions around, so it's worth going on, as opposed to other times when nothing. But that also demonstrates a grey line, possibly a grey line effect, where you've got the difference, that grey area between dark and light in the evening. Now that is an amazing one. That I haven't seen one like that. That came. I picked that up the other day. Hardly anyone bothers in Alice Springs that will even hardly bother to talk to you on the repeater. I tell you what, you've got to actually. I went to Darwin a few months ago, and I actually talked to the secretary of the club up there, and I said, "I'm coming up. When's your club day?" And I went round and I had coffee with them. And I said, look, every time I come up to Darwin to visit relatives, there's nobody answers. I said, well, we don't know you. I thought that's something wrong with amateur radio when you've got to know somebody before they'll talk to you. But anyway, they said, this is a great idea. Because they heard me talking on the radio and they'd come up and chat to me. They said, oh, I've never heard so much activity for a long time. You go, I know.
So taking it to talking to strangers then?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I don't know what it is. But, anyway, well, all right, they say,
They helped us out a few years ago, didn't they? With an antenna and...
We took some rigs up there and didn't have any antennas, and one of the local hams, well, you never learn with an antenna.
Yeah, I mean, they're terrific once you break in, but you've got to sort of break in, haven't you? Yeah. Yeah, so anyway, that was an interesting thing. My daughter lives up near the Gold Coast, and Lismore, or the Summerland Radio Club, they're the people who came to visit us one day. The president and the secretary, I think, came, and we were doing a kids' workshop at the time. They've gone back and done all that stuff up there. I get their newsletter. So when I went up there, I called them too, and they were going to have coffee with me, but it didn't work out, with my daughter's schedule. There was no time for amateur radio, unfortunately. Anyway, that's an amazing thing, because that activity I've never seen it like that before. So that day was also pretty good on single sideband. People are reporting that they had tremendous signals.
What frequency was that on?
2 meters. Yeah. But it just shows you that they've got across the English, not the English channel, the American channel, the Atlantic. They got across the Atlantic at last. Well, they've cheated a bit. It's like a remote island off Europe and some equally Bahamas or something, But at least it's across the Atlantic, And they've done it using these methods. Still hoping for a voice signal, but in the meantime. Okay, well, that explains a bit about the program. There's a lot of settings to get your rig working on it. It took me a long time, but I'm getting pretty good at it now. Now look at that one. That's for Tony. That's one for you, Tony. Look at the signals. 1.8 megahertz. Power, 20. Oh, there's one down there for 0.05 watts. Okay, so that's on top band. Who would have thought? Okay, so that's... and there's something on... There's the WSPR site. That's on 40 meters, I believe, and showing that at night all that activity is happening locally in Europe and America, plus across. Australia had nothing that same period. And so again, you kind of get an idea of what's going on. I actually got picked up in Mexico when I was doing this. I was doing the 6 meter thing. And suddenly, out of Australia goes one like that, and it's me. They're hearing me there. But the rest of the people weren't. So who knows, a little bit of a reflection, a meteor thing or a sporadic-y thing, and it bounced off it. Okay. Well, there you are, short and sweet. Anybody would like to have a look at something going, actually working, I'll be over there after I've got my coffee. But yeah. So are there any questions?
Not much trans-equatorial in that. Everything seemed to be east and west rather than north and south.
And possibly because there's no reception, no stations there. We seem to be the leaders in whisper on BHF.
A lot of our contacts are trans-equatorial into Asia.
Well, that's right. But but this doesn't reflect it if there's nobody there actually transmitting either way. And of course, out of all those stations, some of them are just listening. And so if everybody just listens, no lines either. FT817s. That's what I usually use because that can sit there, the tiny little rig with that. Still runs it. It's standard Yaesu protocols. The leads plug in the same way. And as long as your aerials are tuned to all the different frequencies, you can have band hopping. You can actually tick a lot of boxes to say it will go from one band to the other randomly as well. Okay, no more questions?
So Tony, that according to that website, I think I emailed you that I hadn't known about either. They actually use a lot of the propagation reporting to look at what the ionosphere is doing and sunspot activity and so forth for scientific research.
Yeah.
So there can be some real scientific use for some of this data that we generate all the time.
Absolutely. That site, I looked at it in this preparation, and honestly, the charts and the stuff, and it's called real-time propagation or something, and it's what's actually happening right now as a result of all this data coming in and there. Yep. So, plenty to do there. Plenty to do.
A couple of months ago when you were in Darwin, you actually checked in to the 80-metre net here in Bendigo.
I did, didn't I?
And what was the technique you used there?
Well, I was using the remote radio situated in Croydon.
Right, Croydon, yes,
And as I was texting you, I had your phone go off. My text triggered his phone, and because he was on.
So you're listening.
I was listening to it, and so I wasn't, So I am prepared to use the internet in emergencies.
So you're sort of like crossband.
Exactly, crossband telephone and internet stroke radio.
Yeah. But using the remotely controlled SDRs is really good because when you run the net, sometimes there are people you can't hear using your own equipment, but they do come in on the SDR because it's further away and the transmission distance is right in the skip zone or the dead zone. You're in the dead zone, the SDR is not.
Yes, and I discovered that the benefits of that was that, you remember that time I met you, the first time I met you was at the telegraph station here in Castlemaine.
I remember it well.
Yes. Well, I had a radio set up there. I couldn't hear a thing because Telstra was next door. And the interference was horrendous. We couldn't even hear on 2 meters. So one day I was listening to a remote receiver down in Melbourne, heard a station in Malden or somewhere, I knew the frequency, turned my rig to that frequency, transmit. I listened to the remote receiver. He comes back. I'm chatting to him. I think I know how good this is, If your receiver's not working at your location, you can still make contacts, that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you.